everyone, and welcome to this video series on the attributes of human services organizations. This is part 3 of the series, which will cover the primacy of the institutional environment as described in Zeke Hasenfeld's textbook, Human Services as Complex Organizations. So when we're talking about the primacy of the institutional environment or the importance of the institutional environment, what we're really trying to get at is this idea of legitimacy. So if social workers are charged with moral work, like I described in the previous video in terms of what moral work is, then the HSO that employs those workers must have legitimate reasons for allowing them to engage in this type of work. So let's just really quickly review what we mean by moral work. So social workers make value judgments, and the morality of those values is what controls or shapes the behaviors of clients, because those values lead to certain expectations of what is considered proper or appropriate or good behavior. And in terms of legitimacy, what we're talking about here is conformity to the laws and rules of the entities in the environment. So this legitimacy for HSOs comes from those in the environment that surround the HSO. And who are those entities? They can be legislators, other human service organizations, clients, the community, etc. And for most HSOs, the two primary entities that provide legitimacy are the state and the profession, the social work profession. And in terms of the social work profession, that's the entity that decides what services are to be delivered by whom, etc. And as we'll learn later, obviously there is an interaction that's happening between the HSO and the surrounding environment when it comes to legitimacy. And mainly this has to do with conflicts that can arise between regulations or what's required by the state and then the professional standards that the HSO and the social workers have to abide by. So the environment, according to Hasenfeld, contains diverse interest groups upholding conflicting values and norms. And this has to do with the changing forces that affect those value conflicts in the environment. So if we think about it, we have increasing ethnic diversity. We have changing concepts about what constitutes a family. We have the introduction of new practices or services, or what the text calls technologies. And then we have the aging of the population, among other, social forces that are changing, constantly changing in our environment in general. And so all this to say that values change over time. So if values change over time, then regulations change over time, professional standards change over time, and sometimes those can conflict. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of values changing over time, because it is kind of a central sort of theme for the class. In particular, this idea that notions of who is deserving, quote unquote, versus undeserving, quote unquote, change over time. Many years ago, actually not that far back, even back in the 70s and 80s, and a little bit of the 90s, domestic violence, marital rape, etc. were considered a family problem and not something that the state would intervene in. And because of feminism and other social movements, those values surrounding those ideas have changed, and now we view domestic violence quite differently than we did before, and that therefore then is going to affect the types of services that are going to be provided to those who are now considered deserving of services. Okay, so that's just one example. But the key here is that these notions that change, these values that change over time have effects on human service organizations. How? Well, because the changes in values affect the policies that are enacted. Like we talked about in the history of social welfare class, where we were going over all the different policies and the values that underlie enactment of those policies. That's what we're talking about here as well. So these changing notions of deserving and undeserving affect those policies, which then means that those policies are therefore going to affect how HSOs can operate and their legitimacy in terms of what services are being provided and how. So Hasenfeld suggests that seeking legitimacy as values change and in response to these changing social forces is what makes human service organizations seem to be always in a sort of crisis mode. In other words, HSOs are always trying to adjust and reaffirm the legitimacy of their efforts in response to the changes that are always happening in the institutional environment, the environment that affects this institution. So let me give you an example of this crisis. When we think about child welfare organizations, for example, Child Protective Services, we're constantly seeing headlines of child deaths or other issues with protective services across the country. These are just a few examples. But the key here is that these are crisis points that happen. So let's look at what this crisis looks like and what this cycle looks like. So we have a social problem in this country relating to child abuse. Okay? We consider it a social problem, one, because it affects a large number of our population. Two, it causes distress and has other negative consequences for the child. But three, it also has negative consequences to society in the form of perhaps juvenile delinquency, costs for mental health care, etc. So because of these three criteria, if you will, we consider this a social problem. Our response to this social problem as a society was to create child protective services in the form of public child welfare as a system. So how is Child Protective Services addressing this social problem? Well, agency provides therapy, substance abuse counseling to parents, parent training, respite care, auxiliary services in the form of transportation vouchers, etc. So there are a ton of services actually that Child Protective Services provides or contracts for. But even with all of this social problem has not been fully ameliorated. So we still have child abuse that's happening despite all of these efforts over all of these years. And then on top of that, we get new cases of child deaths in the system that prop up. And this leads to this crisis where people in the environment are asking, why aren't current practices working? Why isn't therapy working? Why isn't substance abuse counseling working? Why isn't, etc. So what the HSO has to do in this situation then is maintain or regain its legitimacy. And how does it do this? Via, as Hasenfeld puts it, renewed moral entrepreneurship and realignment of the moral system that guides its services. And then once it does this, the cycle just starts all over again until the problem can actually be eradicated. But you may be asking yourself, or asking me, Dr. B, what do you mean by moral entrepreneurship? Moral entrepreneurship. Well, what Hasenfeld means is that human service organizations use the strength of their positions to affect policy and service responses from a particular moral standpoint. And that standpoint is their commitment to social ends and values. So all this to say that HSO's moral standpoint is to help people and address a particular social problem or social problems. Okay, so this is their standpoint that they're taking. So moral entrepreneurship then is common for HSOs as they attempt to influence public conceptions via the moral categorization of their clients and the services that they provide. And an example of this can be seen in the child abuse example that I gave. Well, the realignment involves, in this case, probably new training of workers. So, some higher up at the Child Protection Agency will come out and say, because of this, we've reviewed, the case of the child death or whatever the situation was, and we've noted that, X, Y, and Z are areas that that the social workers need to improve, and so we're going to add that to our training. Or they'll come up with some sort of new technology, which just means a new service, and hopefully it's an evidence-based service or practice. So the higher up may come out and say, we're going to try this new practice, like safety organized practice that we're going to implement, and hopefully this will address the underlying factors that led to the death or the situation. So by doing this, they're controlling the narrative of what led to the crisis. They're showing the entities in the environment that provide them with legitimacy that they've looked into the matter carefully, so no one else needs to. They've identified what led to the crisis and how they're going to address it. Again, based on their moral standpoint of what it needs to take to address the social problem. Okay, so that's all I have to say about this particular topic of the primacy of the institutional environment. Next up, we're going to have part 4, which is the institutional bases of human service technologies. And again, remember, technologies just means services. Okay, that's it. Here are the sources of the images. And as always, email me if you have any questions or leave a comment. And I will either see you here or in class. Thank you. Bye.